Okay, so good afternoon. Welcome everyone to the first public debriefing of this year, following the 42nd ordinary BEREC plenary meeting, which was held last week in Belgrade. It was a busy plenary meeting, and a little bit like today's meeting, we also had the coronavirus situation to deal with. We had a number of remote participants, and I assume that we have a bigger than normal percentage of remote participants today as well because of this situation. We had a lot of documents that we're going to be telling you about in a while, approved for publication, and we also had 3 approved for public consultation that we will be discussing. So here on the podium, I am joined by next year's incoming chair, Michel van Bellingen, who will talk a little bit later about the BEREC Strategy. On his right, we have the co-chair of the Fixed Network Evolution Working Group, Wilhelm Schramm, who will share the decision on the draft guidelines for VHCN and also on the adoption document for a Network Termination Point. To his immediate left, we have the co-chair of the BEREC End Users Working Group, Teresa Hurrigan, who will talk about the work from her working group. And at the end, we have Begonia Garcia Marinoso, hope I pronounced that relatively well, who will share some information about the statistics and indicate the working group where she is a co-chair. And on my left, I have Ola and Laszlo and Elizabeth, who are helping us with the meeting. So again, warm welcome to all. Some documents that were approved for publication at the meeting that we will not be discussing in great length today. I'm just going to introduce here. We had the 24th International Roaming Benchmark Data Report. This is a document that we produce yearly. And then we had a data report on Western Balkans. This is an annex to the roaming benchmark data report. It's a new kind of document that we will be producing for the future. It's done in cooperation with the Western Balkan NRAs and supporting them to collect the data to monitor price and volume development in a similar way to what we do inside the Union. We then had 2 documents on feasibility studies of 5G, and this is intended. There first was a public consultation, which is what is summarized in the report, and then there was the study itself, which essentially explains how we, in a consistent and coherent way, can measure coverage information regarding 5G deployments. So that's a little bit looking forward to 5G deployments. Here on this slide, you see the dates for public consultations that were adopted and approved in Belgrade last week, and which will be explained a little bit more in detail later on. I just wanted you to show you a summary of the launch dates. So the launch dates for all of these documents will be today, which is in line with our normal practice. And then the closing days of the public consultation, we have again tried to shift them a little bit so that not everything ends at the same day. And you see that there are therefore a little bit different number of days for each of the consultations. We are mindful of all the stakeholders' needs for reviewing inside whatever structure you have these issues. And then the final document that I'm going to say a few words on is also a document that was adopted on from our regulatory framework group, which is not on the slide, I think. And it's about numbering resources anyway. So there's a consultation that starts, no, a consultation. Numbering.
No, it's final.
It's final, yeah. So that's a final, it's a guideline on numbering, the use of numbering resources by by other than electronic communication network or services entities. So that's a new piece of legislation that is helping us to deal with that opportunity to allocate numbering resources to such entities, which comes from the code. So that's all for the introduction, and now I'm going to pass the floor. That's where it was, yes? Now I'm passing the floor to Wilhelm, who will talk about the NTP topologies. No, VHCN first, sorry.
Yes, the first guideline is the draft BEREC Guidelines on very high capacity networks. According to Article 82 of the European Electronic Communications Code, BEREC shall issue guidelines on the criteria that the network has to fulfill in order to be considered a very high capacity network, in terms of downlink and uplink bandwidth, resilience, error-related parameters, latency, and its variation. Criteria for the definition of very high capacity networks laid down in the draft guidelines. The guidelines define that any network which fulfills one or more of the following four criteria is a very high capacity network. Criterion 1, any network providing a fixed line connection with a fiber rollout at least up to the multi-dwelling building. Criterion 2, any network providing a wireless connection with a fiber rollout up to the base station. Criterion 3, any network providing a fixed line connection which is capable of delivering, under usual peak time conditions, services to the end users with the following quality of service. Downlink data rate at least 1 gigabit per second. Uplink data rate at least 200 megabits per second. IP packet error ratio not more than 0.05%. IP packet loss ratio not more than 0.0025%. Round-trip IP packet delay not more than 10 milliseconds. IP packet delay variation not more than 2 milliseconds. And IP service availability at least 99.9% per year. Criterion 4, any network providing a wireless connection which is capable of delivering, under usual peak time conditions, services to the end users with the following quality of service. Downlink data rate at least 150 megabits per second. Uplink data rate at least 50 megabits per second. IP packet error ratio not more than 0.01%. IP packet loss ratio not more than 0.005%. Round-trip IP packet delay not more than 25 milliseconds. IP packet delay variation not more than 6 milliseconds. And IP service availability at least 99.81% per year. The criteria, the quality of service thresholds of criterion 4 refer to outdoor locations only and to the average value within the coverage area considered. The criteria are defined in accordance with the European Electronic Communications Code and based on data collected from network operators. Application of the criteria. Criterion 1. Criterion 1 is fulfilled, for example, in case of fiber to the building and fiber to the home. Criterion 1 is not fulfilled in case, for example, with a fiber rollout up to a node to which multiple single-family houses are connected, even only a few. Criterion 2. Criterion 2 is fulfilled, for example, in case of a mobile network with a fiber rollout up to the base station, or a public Wi-Fi network with a fiber rollout up to the access point. Criterion 3 and criterion 4. The network needs to be capable of delivering of meeting the quality of service thresholds during peak time of criterion 3 and criterion 4. It is not necessary that the network actually offers a service with such a quality of service. And it is also not necessary that all services provided by the network have to meet the quality of service thresholds. The quality of service thresholds of criterion 4 and criterion 3 have been defined based on data collected from network operators. In total, operators filled in 204 questionnaires, and the data of 106 of them have been taken into account. The quality of service thresholds of criterion 3 are based on the achievable end-user quality of service of networks which provide a fixed line connection with a fiber rollout up to the multi-dwelling building and the best technology deployed on the in-building network infrastructure, G.fast 212 MHz on in-building copper twisted pair, and DOCSIS 3.1 on in-building coax network. The quality of service thresholds of criterion 4 are based on the achievable end-user quality of service of mobile networks with a fiber rollout up to the base station and the best LTE advanced 4G technology in terms of aggregated spectrum, MIMO order, modulation, etc. In order to take 5G into account as much as possible, the data rate thresholds are based on the 90% percentile of the data collected from the network operators, not on the median. The guidelines foresee that BEREC intends to update criterion 4 as soon as 5G has reached mature deployment and significant penetration, not later than 2023. The next guidelines. Okay.
So I should have said in the beginning that we're going to present all of the guidelines just in one go. So note your questions. We're not going to break for questions after each individual presentation.
BEREC guidelines on common approaches to the identification of the network termination point in different network topologies. Outcome of the public consultation. The public consultation ran from 7th of October until 21st of November last year, and in total, BEREC received 68 contributions. The objectives of the report on the outcome of the public consultations are to provide an overview of the contributions received and to present BEREC's response to them, in particular with regard to the need to adapt the draft BEREC guidelines. Main result. The stakeholders expressed divergent and also opposite views and provided comments on many different aspects. Topics addressed in the contributions. Network termination point to be located at point A. Point A means modem, router, and other equipment at the customer premises is part of the telecommunications terminal equipment. Several stakeholders suggested that the guidelines shall define that the fixed network termination point is located at point A, or at least that point A is the rule. Several other stakeholders had the opposite view that the network termination point to be located at point A is not possible or not appropriate. The response is, according to the outcome of the NRA assessment foreseen in the guidelines, both is possible, that the network termination point is located at point A or at a different point. Therefore, there is no need to adapt the guidelines. Legal provisions. Several stakeholders pointed out that the end user's right to use their own terminal equipment follows unambiguously from the Open Internet Regulation and the Directive on Competition in the Telecommunications Terminal Equipment Market. Several other stakeholders had the opposite view that the European Electronic Communications Code is the sole legal basis for the definition of the location of the network termination point. The response is, the network termination point represents a boundary between, on one side, the regulatory framework for electronic communications networks and services, and on the other side, the regulation of telecommunications terminal equipment. In order to set the location of this boundary, the location of the network termination point appropriately, it is necessary to consider both sides of the boundary, and therefore the regulatory framework of both sides need to be taken into account. Several other stakeholders argued that the definition of the location of the network termination point shall only be based on the definition of the term network termination point in the European Electronic Communications Code. The response is, this is not possible. Different locations of the network termination point are conform with the definition of the term network termination point. Several other stakeholders had the opposite view that also other legal provisions of the European Electronic Communications Code need to be considered, for example, access regulation. The response is, a new section, access regulation, in the European Electronic Communications Code has been included in the guidelines. Impact on the telecommunications terminal equipment market. Several stakeholders agree with the impact on the telecommunications terminal equipment market presented in the draft guidelines. Several other stakeholders argued that the draft guidelines overstate the positive effects on the telecommunications terminal equipment market. The response is, further arguments have been added in the guidelines, and the impact on the telecommunications terminal equipment market is now described in more detail. Implementation of the modem functionality. Several stakeholders suggested that the guidelines shall define that the implementation of the modem functionality is only allowed with standalone modems. Several other stakeholders had the opposite view that integrated access devices with all other functionalities switched off are also allowed. The response is the technological implementation of the modem functionality is out of scope of the guidelines. Wholesale level and open access. Several stakeholders pointed out that the provision of wholesale access services and open access models may have an impact on the definition of the location of the network termination point. The response is, the guidelines have been adapted and now make clear that the NRA assessment shall take this aspect into account. Shared media. Several stakeholders expressed the view that in case of access based on a shared medium, for example cable networks or passive optical networks, active equipment needs to be part of the public network to identify the network termination point. The response is, the European Electronic Communications Code does not require this, and it is not possible to identify the network termination point as physical point with active equipment in shared media. Only certain networks or certain services. One stakeholder suggested that the guidelines shall only consider networks of the future and traditional networks shall not be included in the guidelines. Another stakeholder expressed the view that the guidelines shall only consider broadband networks. And another stakeholder argued that the guidelines shall not consider business services. The response is, according to the European Electronic Communications Code, the scope of the guidelines is not limited to a certain type of network or to a certain type of service. Therefore, there is no need to adapt the guidelines. The stakeholders' contribution addressed many other topics. The response is, several further adaptations of the guidelines have been made.
Thank you. I'll introduce the guidelines detailing the quality of service parameters. The background to this is obviously the new obligation set out under Article 104 of the new code. And just to recap what this set of guidelines is about, under the provision of the code, national regulatory authorities may require providers to publish information for end users on quality of service. And 104.2 states NRA shall specify, taking utmost account of BEREC guidelines, the quality parameters to be measured, the applicable measurement methods, the content, form and manner of the information to be published, including possible quality certification mechanisms. The guidelines were consulted on from October to December. We received 11 responses to the consultation. The guidelines were set out with the legal basis, the parameters and measurement methods relevant for ICS, the additional QoS measurements being proposed for SMS and customer service, QoS parameters relevant for end users with disabilities. We also dealt with publication of information, looking at the type of the approach to the publication of the information, and through 5 headings, being the information should be comprehensive, comparable, reliable, user-friendly and up-to-date. The quality certification mechanisms, the code doesn't require that NRAs establish or certify a certification mechanism. However, we did set out a number of criteria in the guidelines paper, being accuracy, accessibility, openness, safety and future-proofing. So that was the guidelines that were consulted on in October. We received, as I said, 11 responses, mainly from telcos and consumer associations. Just to give you a little bit of background, what's on the slide there are all the quality of service parameters and standards. I don't intend talking through them, but I do want to give you some background and the action that's been taken based on the responses we've received. So one of the main input from the consultation and the guidelines, we had referred out to the work being done by the Open Internet Group, and we hadn't proposed in our guidelines that we would actually set out a table for IAS. You will now see that the guidelines have a new table, Table 1A, and whilst the measurement still refers to the Open Internet work that's been done and published in the 2017 document, we now have also included the definitions for latency, jitter and packet loss ratio. So this was as a result of feedback from the responses to the consultation, and we have incorporated a review of the guidelines. So as the work of the Open Internet Group progresses, our guidelines will also be updated. With regard to Table 2, we took on board the feedback with regard to SMS parameters and whether they're relevant going into the future, and we removed them from the table. Likewise, we've reduced the customer service from 3 to 2. So overall, there was 5 measures proposed under Table 2, and in the guidelines that are being published now, there's just 2. Table 3 set out the guidelines for the disabled end users. We got very good quality feedback with regard to the measures and what's applicable, and pointing us to the relevant ETSI standards. So you will note that the references have been updated to more recent publications and the associated measures. So whilst the measures themselves haven't changed, it's just the reference to the ETSI standards have been updated to mirror the most up-to-date publications. With regard to the publication of information and the quality certification mechanisms, we made some slight updates to the wording, but they have more or less stayed the same, with the overarching principles for the publication of information in accordance with what's set out in Article 104. The proposed review of the guidelines is going to go ahead within 2 years from the adoption and publication of the current set of guidelines, and this will ensure that any new standards that are introduced can be considered in view of going forward. So that's what's being published based on the consultation and the feedback received.
So I took you through the BEREC guidelines on the geographical surveys of network deployments. Okay, Article 22 establishes that by 2023, member states shall conduct a geographical survey of the reach of electronic communication networks capable of delivering broadband. BEREC is set to issue guidelines on the consistent implementation of this article. Okay? As agreed by the board last year, Phase 1 guidelines, this is what we are presenting today, are the guidelines that explain what are the performance and network reach parameters. And those parameters are quality of service 1 parameters. This is calculated coverage and performance information as opposed to measurements. So this is the guidelines we are presenting today. This year we had 3 workshops and a 10-week consultation on the draft guidelines that took place in autumn. And we had 27 responses, including operators, associations, public authorities, and citizens. The responses were very varied and touching on many, many different aspects. And I will come back to some of the comments made when I go through the guidelines. Okay? The guidelines we are presenting here, which are revised and final, provide a substantive step forward in that they deliver on a set of common informations in Europe, which will be useful to regulatory and policy functions, but not only this, but will provide for a more consistency regulatory policy and better information in order to take pan-European policies. On the details, okay? Yeah. For resolution, for fixed networks, the level of resolution is the address. For mobile networks, the resolution should be a grid of 100 by 100 meters or an equivalent polygon, at least. Since address level resolution is quite ambitious, it is admitted that temporarily NRAs or OCAs resort to a grid in the case of fixed networks, okay? The guidelines deliver on a set of common definitions: mobile and fixed broadband reach, premises and addresses passed. These are definitions that are almost as in the draft guidelines, but we have new definition on speed indicators, maximum achievable speed. This is a speed that is a reference of optimal network conditions rather than contracted or experienced speed, and also expected peak time speed. This is speeds that reflect peak time conditions, where peak time conditions are not defined in the guidelines. This is up to NRAs and OCAs to define. The guidelines also provide a list of specific indicators to collect for fixed and mobile broadband. For fixed technologies, for fixed broadband, there is technologies in the last mile, VHCN indicator. A VHCN indicator that has improved is richer than what was proposed in the draft guidelines, because now the VHCN indicator provides for the 4 different criteria that William has just explained in the draft VHCN guidelines, okay? Download and upload speed classes, both for maximum achievable speed, this network performance, and for expected peak time speed. And also optionally, an NGA indicator. For mobile, the guidelines provide for technology, coverage of technology, 2G, 3G, 4G, 5G, 5G of different kinds, a VHCN indicator, which is more granular than what was proposed, and also optionally maximum speed information. On the planned network deployments, this information may be collected by NRS or OCAs and is required to identify designated areas, as explained in Article 22.2, and for stated purposes. The guidelines specify that the information has to be delivered at the address or small grid, 100-meter resolution, insofar this information is available and can be provided with reasonable effort. So this information is collected at one stage, and at that stage it should be address level, if this is possible to provide and can be provided with reasonable effort, okay? The guidelines also deliver on the methods to publish information, address the issue of confidentiality, and provide indications on how to aggregate data at the grid level in order to achieve a comparability of results. Finally, there is a strong recommendation that member states, public authorities should be using geographical information systems in order to carry out the managing of this data. In the future, BEREC is going to work on an implementation report, seeing how the different countries have dealt with these guidelines, and then further on, on the revision of the guidelines.
Thank you very much, and hello everybody. As already mentioned by Dan, the draft BEREC strategy is to be published later this day. We have proposed a new mission statement based off one of the previous one in the former 1470 midterm strategy by updating and replacing electronic communications by digital markets, because we are in a digital era. Also, the period is a 5 years strategy instead of 3, linked with a multi-annual work program. And we think it's a better alignment on the legislative cycle of the European Commission, so we can take all these European priorities into consideration, and because 5 years is a linked period, we have also the ability to revisit it via flexible updates where needed. In this digital area, we've gone through all those different areas, market, technological and policy developments, and so the 6 topics you see on the slide, and of course the priorities of the European Commission have been taken into account. This is important too. So we came up with the proposal of 3 high-level strategic priorities instead of 5 in the previous midterm strategy. What is important too is the successful implementation of the code and the focus on sustainability. And those are horizontal principles that are important for this new strategy. 3 high-level strategic priorities to start with: promoting full connectivity. How shall we do this? By continuing the work done on the guidelines to the benefit of investment on very high capacity networks to create stability and predictability, by monitoring the development of 5G networks, and also the implementation of all cybersecurity instruments, especially about 5G. How will BEREC support sustainable and open digital markets? By continuing the work done on the open internet, also to ensure the predictable and consistent implementation of open internet regulation, but also by building in this digital era the knowledge base within the digital economy, to make sure that all those legal, economic, technological and consumer protection perspectives are well integrated in the design and practice of regulation. This is an important point for digital platform regulation, and there is one element which is not addressed yet by the current draft, is the institutional aspect on the last topic. And of course, it is important for an organization like BEREC to define the relevant goals about sustainability too. Last high-level strategic priorities is about empowering end users. How will BEREC achieve this? By promoting a very high level of consumer protection, so that end users well aware of their rights, but also well informed about the choices they can make, and that's the reason why transparency measures are important, and with the different tools, tariff comparison tools, or mapping networks, mapping. And as you know, by the end of next year, BEREC will make an assessment of all those end-user protections provision in a report. There are always rooms for improvements, and to start with the cooperation. There are two types of cooperation: the institutional one, with all these agencies, bodies, advisory committees within the EU, or with the competent authorities of third country, with international organizations too, which is already the case for spectrum in RSPG, or network security with ENISA, or about audiovisual with ERGA, or non-privacy with the European body of European Data Protection Body, sorry. But also the international cooperation with third countries to promote the European model. This is something BEREC has an ambition for. Room for improvement about sustainability, of course, in the context of the Green Deal, running an organization like BEREC and BEREC Office has also consequences in terms of paper, plastic use, and so on, and CO2 emissions. Developing the right tool is another element, especially for end users, but not only. And at last, the way to engage with stakeholder. We've tried, but I will say a few words about this later. A new formula for the next stakeholder forum. And so for the time being, the stakeholder forum is foreseen on the 1st of April, but it is still subject to monitoring because of this coronavirus situation. So we'll have to make an assessment if this is something we were able to maintain or not. But for the time being, there is no news on this. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all four of you for very clear and concise presentations. So with that, I think I will open the floors to both the physical floor to those present, and I think the virtual floor has already been open for questions. Do we have any questions or comments in the room?
Yes, good afternoon. My name is Frederik de Bakker. I work for Telefonica. And I mean, I just want to confirm that I will try to be there on the 1st of April. So I hope you will maintain the forum. Now I have a question actually for Michel van Bellingen on the point, as one of the goals is keeping open digital markets, so a broader view, of course, than only telecom markets, which we as Telefonica definitely applaud that BEREC widens his view and all the NRAs. But my question would be, I mean, how are you internally preparing for that broader view? Because on level of expertise, are you now retraining people or hiring more people focused on more digital issues? I wonder if how NRAs on a practical level are addressing this issue. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Frederik. This is something we've discussed during the last plenary meeting, and we'll still have a discussion on plenary 2 in Helsinki regarding the views we will give on this specific issue when the Commission will launch a public consultation within a few days or a few weeks. But I don't think we specifically addressed training of people or this specific issues for the time being. I think that we need to be open to these developments on the one hand, and without forgetting the focus on the core of our activities. Of course, this is something new for BEREC. This is something we have no legal competence for the time being, so we'll see about that in the future. So that's the reason why it's a little bit soon to give you a very precise answer to your question.
Getting the hang of the microphones here. Apparently we can only have one microphone at a time. I think that's the problem. Anyone else in the room who would like to? Please.
Good afternoon. Theo Sikkingen from Bird and Bird, and speaking on behalf of the Dutch Fixed and Mobile Operators Association. A question to Mr. van Bellingen. I believe you said you would also like to strengthen the relationship, for instance, with ENISA. And if so, how do you plan to, are you planning to give that a structural basis? Or would you like to consult, engage with ENISA on a case-by-case basis?
I think I'll take that. You know, in the mini board of BEREC, we have a division of responsibility for our various working groups, and I happen to be the one looking after a little bit extra the ad hoc working group on cybersecurity. So, you know, this was a new development last year. We never had a working group like that before, and that's, of course, all due to what happens in society and the upgrading of security issues in electronic communication, more generally speaking. So I think this is a development phase. It's still an ad hoc working group. We are working together with ENISA. For example, we have planned to have a joint seminar at the end of this month, which is another one of those events that is a little bit now with a question mark due to the corona situation. What will happen in the extension? Will there be like with the RSPG some sort of document? We haven't decided yet, to be honest. And I think the important thing is that we are reaching out to each other. We see that there are things that we can bring to ENISA, especially I think our contacts with the operators, which we have much bigger experience of having than perhaps they have. And they, on the other hand, of course, in the security area have a lot of expertise. So we're trying to find different ways of merging these competences and bringing them to those who need to be informed about the new situations. And then we'll see whether it becomes something we document in some sort of memorandum of understanding or another form. I think, Luc, you wanted to ask a question?
Yeah, so I'm Luc Hendricks. I'm the Director General of ECTA, the European Competitive Telecommunication Association. So we represent the competitive forces in Europe. I have a question, I think, for Michel. So first of all, thank you very much for organizing the debriefing and for giving us the opportunity to ask questions and to participate, even in those circumstances that we all know. Yeah, when I saw that the three strategic priorities, I think I may recognize why you put those strategies, certainly to a certain extent. The question I have, how do you reconcile this with the four objectives of the code and more particularly the competitive dimension that remains one of the main objectives of the code? And certainly when it comes to the first pillar, when we speak about connectivity, the take-up is of course very important. So do I miss something, or do I have the impression that competition has been a little bit lost in the process?
Thank you very much for your question, Luc. As I already mentioned, but maybe too too quickly, the full and successful implementation of the code is one of the key principles for this strategy. So, of course, competition aspects are to be included in this. So, definitely.
Thank you for this clarification, and I mention it because we know that there are lots of important files ongoing, and I take this opportunity and this fora to mention the point on the review on the relevant markets. So I presume that many of the people around the table have participated to the streaming of the workshop by Weekend and the European Commission. And for example, on the slide that were presented when it came to the inclusion of the treatment of cable in the regulation, the example of Belgium was not mentioned. The way that you treated cable and what you did with market 3B is in our view most relevant, because Belgium and the Netherlands are the two most representative countries of what represent cable. And so I think from a BEREC perspective, we certainly expect that this objective of competition remains at the right place it deserves, and certainly going forward with all the work that needs to get done, and even more particularly when it comes to finding solutions on the B2B markets, so on the business markets, that are very important for all the other sectors of the economy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Luc. We note, of course, these comments. Anyone else who would like to raise a question? Oliver.
Hello, everybody. Hello, everybody. And this is Oliver Fuchs, Director of Competition and Regulation at the European Competitive Telecommunications Association. I have a question for Mr. Schramm, and I have another question for Therese. So on the NTP guidance, thank you also to Dan for organizing a stakeholder workshop closely to the adoption of the guidance, which I think presented a very good overview of the various points that people thought were important in this particular regard. And I just wanted to hear how have the final guidelines actually responded to the point that was raised by various stakeholders that the draft didn't yet really consider a multiplicity of topologies. So that would be one point, and the other point would be it's a BEREC guidance document. What is the agreed, let's say, sentiment among participants to the working group, how this will affect national administrative practice? Has there been any further guidance given on how these guidelines are supposed to be applied by regulators in terms of sketching these common approaches that the code actually required to be elaborated? On the quality of service guidelines, I'd like to know, one of our concerns was that these extra informational requirements might be imposed without actually there having been a real test of whether there was a lack of information or not. And I would like to know how the guidelines have responded to this point. I mean, is there now a test foreseen as to the availability of information in the market, or how have you handled this aspect? Thank you very much.
Thank you for your questions. Your first point with regard to NTP guidelines was the question whether or to what extent different topologies are considered in the NTP guidelines, if I have understood your question correctly. The response is that the draft guidelines already took into account different network topologies, and the criteria for the NRA assessment are applicable to all network topologies. For example, in the section with regard to the definition of the term network termination point, there are different paragraphs, or there's a differentiation made between point-to-point topology. There's a further explanation about that. And in particular, also with regard to point-to-multipoint topology, there are specific explanations. I have also mentioned in the presentation that several stakeholders have expressed the view that in case of point-to-multipoint topologies, an active equipment needs to be part of the public network to identify a network termination point. This has been considered in detail. Our conclusion is that this is not possible because the definition of the term network termination point is that the network termination is a physical point. So the network address is capable to identify the active equipment, but not the physical location where it is where is it located in the shared medium. Because a shared medium is more or less a broadcast, so that in downstream direction the traffic is sent to all endpoints of the shared media, and every endpoint receives exactly the same information. And therefore there is also no switching and routing in this case, and the definition of the term network termination point in the European Electronic Communication Code does this take into account. It explicitly says only in case of networks which involve switching and routing, then the network address, the network termination point is identified with a network address. And there are also several other aspects with regard to data protection, where specific measurements are necessary in case of shared media to protect the data, the private sphere of the data from the individual end users. And this is also taken into account in the guidelines. Then I go to the second question you raised on information and further guidance for NRAs, how they shall apply the guidelines at the national level. This has been considered. In our view, the guidelines have already rather precisely described the criteria an NRA shall take into account. And with regard to this, we have included one further paragraph that there may be, from the national circumstances depending, situations where a transitional period may be necessary, depending on the decision made at the national level. If there's a big change in the decision, then it may be important that the NRA will foresee an appropriate transitional period at the national level. So that's from my side.
In relation to the end users query, the working group and discussed the point raised. However, we feel that it's for the individual NRAs to make the decision in accordance with 104.1 of the code. So therefore, the BEREC guidelines didn't extend further in sharing an opinion on that.
Thank you. We also had a question for Begonia, I think, from the Thank you. So the question is, as far as I understood, there will be some flexibility for NRAs under the guidelines of Article 22 of the Code to define what are peak time conditions. How do these relate to the definition of peak time provided in the VHCN draft guidelines?
Okay, so the new definition of expected peak time speed is there to provide consistency with the VHCN guidelines. And also in being coherent with the draft VHCN guidelines, there is no definition set in the guidelines saying this is peak time, what is peak time. It is for every NRA to decide what is peak time. If they want to do this, it may depend on the operator, it may depend on the zone. This is for the NRA to decide, okay? Which is fully consistent with the VHCN guidelines, draft guidelines approach. But in principle, if there is a definition for the VHCN, it should be the same one applied for the geographical surveys. Yes.
Maybe I can further clarify that the wording used in the European Electronic Communications Code is, with regard to very high capacity networks, under usual peak time conditions. This is the wording used with regard to very high capacity networks, that a network has to provide a certain network performance under usual peak time conditions in order to qualify as a very high capacity network. And this is not defined in more detail. Therefore, also the draft guidelines on very high capacity network refer to exactly this wording. And it's up to the NRA to decide. But of course, if an NRA take a decision with regard to this with regard to guidelines on very high capacity network, then it may be the same when he has to carry out the geographical survey with regard to VHCN guidelines deployment.
Thank you very much. Do we have any further questions in the room? Please.
Theo Sikkinger on behalf of the Dutch Telco Association. I have two questions. The first one to Mr. Schramm and the second one to you then, if I may. The first one is on the NTP guidelines. As we all know, the different network topologies put significant efforts in terms of putting the right obligations and implementation and carrying out of obligations with regard to network security and network integrity. And I was wondering whether you had any further exchange of thoughts on this with ENISA. That was my first question. The second one is on the implementation of the code. I think you rightly said this is one of the high priorities of BEREC and for this year. Within Bird and Bird, we are closely monitoring the draft implementation proposals that come up, and we do notice some significant difference in interpretation between the various countries. For instance, some countries require that for a number of independent communication services, also authorizations are required, which I believe is a mistake. And we also see very different interpretations in terms of consumer and user protection rules. My question is, are you, in that respect, also looking into these proposals, and are you discussing any types of variations you might come across with the European Commission? Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your question. With regard to the topic network security and network integrity and cooperation with the ENISA, the NTP guidelines include a criterion on network security. It's a criterion that the NOS has to consider when he is carrying out the assessment. And we have considered this comment received that there is it considered appropriately to also cooperate with ENISA in this aspect. And we have included several links and references to documents from ENISA in the guidelines. And the guidelines are now finished and now have to be applied by the NRAs. But of course, the NRAs are also involved in ENISA working groups on network security. And so they can also take this knowledge into account when they apply the NTP guidelines at national level. Thank you.
So, and on the implementation of the code, I think BEREC has a number of fairly well-defined tasks in terms of the implementation of the code, many of which are producing the guidelines and the kind of documents that we are discussing and informing you of today. On top of that, of course, each and every NRA is involved together with its government in some fashion of preparations for implementation at national level. And I think, by and large, all of us are at various stages of the legislative national procedures, where it is a little bit difficult for NRAs individually, or indeed for us jointly in BEREC, to have opinions, as it were, about who is doing the right thing or the wrong thing. Of course, it's a good thing that we have the network. We can, when we want to inform, if I wanted to inform my government, for example, of something they were intending to do, which I thought would be the wrong way to do it, would be helpful to talk to Michelle or to Wilhelm or to somebody else and see how are they doing it. But it's not a system, it's not a task allocated to BEREC, and it would indeed be quite a difficult task to have when legislation is in full motion. Anyone else in the room? I think we have no more questions over the if not, we call it the end, and I thank you all very much for joining us for the first public debriefing of this year, and look forward to seeing you all in mid-June after plenary 2. Thank you very much.